My name is Ben Strick. I'm the Director of Investigations for the Centre for Information Resilience. For those of you that haven't heard of CIR, we're a not-for-profit charity. We have just over 170 employees and consultants, and we work around the world documenting and investigating human rights abuses using open source intelligence. So we do a lot of work with media agencies and groups like that, and I'm often lingering around some of these events. And this is my co-presenter, Reid.
Hi everyone, my name is Reid Levinson and I lead visual investigations for Reuters, where I've worked for 7.5 years.
Cool. So just before we start, I think I originally pitched this to the Global Investigative Journalism Conference just because satellite images are so important for us. We see it so much in news articles and news outlets and reporting and investigations and CSOs and NGOs, and we're seeing it more and more and more. And so I think that's how we kind of got in front of you today. I think if we look back at 10 years ago at journalism conferences, or at least the ones that I was lingering at, there definitely weren't sessions on satellite images or seeing red boxes on Google Maps or anything like that. So you're going to see a little bit of that today. And I think we're very excited to show you that. We're very passionate about satellite imagery and open source investigations and things like that. So very excited to get into this. But just as a quick question before we start, has anyone used satellite imagery in their investigations or used it in their storytelling? Okay, so we've got the right audience. That's a good start.
And how many people have reported on a country or a place that was difficult to access? Cool, so we'll be going into that a bit as well.
I think we have the right audience. Great. So just before we start, we've got a graphic warning. So we don't talk about cats and dogs, even though I love them. We do talk about serious issues and human rights abuses, right? So we've mitigated where possible to blur out or to leave out footage, but we will be talking about that content in detail. So please just remember that.
So our topic was very broad. It was initially called satellites. So we're going to try and go over for you why satellite imagery is one of the most powerful and important reporting tools that we have today, how to use and verify these images, and then we're going to go through 5 case studies across the world to give you a sense of the different applications for this kind of reporting.
I wanted to include these 2 individuals on this slide here just to kind of illustrate and show where we are today and why we're speaking about this stuff and why we feel like this is important. So in 1999, we can see an image of Marie Colvin here. She's actually scampered to the top of this mountain in Chechnya, and you can see she's on a massive satellite phone hooked up to a laptop or this kind of satellite computer, and she's basically broadcasting her notes to a newsroom away from, far away from where she's reporting from. That's reporting from the field for her, doing investigative journalism and breaking news. And then we fast forward and we've got someone, a volunteer in Ukraine, fighting for a country and volunteering for a country in 2022. And this is Dasha on the right up here. And we can see in the palm of her hand is a pink item. It records, it shoots, it edits, and it publishes to billions of people. Have a look at the difference between those 2 people right there. Someone was having to scamper to the top of a mountain to send out a little package, and there's someone that can record, can access satellite imagery on their phone, can access data, can reach out to millions or billions of journalists, and also record that kind of content, right? And so by you looking at the growth of satellite imagery and the growth of data and the way that we use this content for mapping, I really wanted to remind everyone of what we're doing here, but also that this content goes towards bringing some level of accountability for people like Dasha as well.
So why are satellite images so important? So we have a little list here. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg, if you will. So first of all, satellite imagery offers verifiable proof of what happened. And the nice thing with this kind of imagery is it's mostly open source. And if it's not open source, it's available on a platform that's easily traceable. You can figure out who took the image and oftentimes even the satellites involved. It's also a tool for when censorship limits information. This kind of imagery offers a window into countries that are hard to access, conflicts where maybe it's dangerous to visit or to report on. Also, we can combat disinformation. We'll go into that a bit in an example in Russia. We can show the evidence, not just tell it. So we're used to, oftentimes as investigative journalists, especially for people who are traditional investigative reporters, we use a lot of witness testimony. This is an example of where you can take that witness testimony and turn a small story into a bigger story and have a visual element to what's otherwise a story about people's memories. And I think for us, the reason we do this is for representation for those affected, to be able to tell the stories and verify the stories of victims and survivors. So I wanted to start with these two satellite images, which I think are quite cool. So the one on the left is an image taken by astronauts at the International Space Station, and on the right is an image taken by a NASA satellite. They're both of the Korean Peninsula, and it really shows you the energy disparity between North Korea and its neighbors, China and South Korea. I think this is quite cool. We get so little reporting out of North Korea, and this is just an example of where one satellite image, two satellite images, tells you a lot about the situation. This is a more recent example in Derna, Libya. I think a lot of people in this room have been following the devastating flooding. More than 11,000 people are estimated to have died just in this city alone. And this is an example of where satellite imagery gives you a really stark, horrific before and after. The thing with satellite imagery, lots of people had photographers, lots of news organizations had photographers on the ground here. When you have a photo of a flood, oftentimes you see a house or you see a street. With a satellite image, you can see the flooding across an entire neighborhood. You can calculate that flooding. You can see the flooding across an entire city. And in Libya, on Tuesday, they kicked out journalists in Derna. Satellite imagery going forward might be one of the only ways we have to continue reporting on this flooding.
So those are some really good points from Reid that we just covered there on why it's important to think about satellite imagery. But also we have some points that we wanted to raise on how, or the importance of using and specifically verifying satellite imagery, so knowing how to use it. So obviously, as we mentioned, the use of satellite imagery or reliance upon it is growing in journalism, news, and specifically breaking news, where we often have a quick turnaround, pressure by editors, no offense to the editors in here, and a quick turnaround on that kind of information. Sometimes we get false information. There may be inaccuracies. For those of you that linger around on Twitter and watch the 21-year-olds posting out satellite images, sometimes that information might not be correct. So it's important to know about how to verify that information yourself. But then there's also the manipulation of satellite imagery, which is on the rise, which is important to think about as well. And that incorrect analysis of satellite imagery. One of the examples that we will go through is around countering disinformation and attempts to claim that satellite imagery is inauthentic and how to go about that as well. So in one of the case studies I wanted to briefly look at, I've got two images on the screen here, and it's a bit of a test for everyone. Does anyone think that one of these images might be fake? Not seeing many hands up. Who here thinks that those are real satellite images? Not seeing many. Not seeing many hands up either. Oh, you see you're in a trick situation here. Does anyone think they're fake? Does anyone want to put their hand up and give it a stab? Yeah, okay, we've got some people up the front here. Maybe you can see clearly. So those are actually fake satellite images. They're actually made through something called Midjourney, which I'm sure you've heard of, on a Discord channel that costs a few bucks a month. I actually made them just about an hour ago by plugging in a couple of sentences and getting like that. Now, obviously, they don't look that good, and I think if you look closely enough, you can see that there's a few inaccuracies at how they're made. But I think it's important to think about this because anyone can access this kind of application. Anyone can create these sorts of images, and anyone can create these sort of manipulated satellite images. And as we go forward in time, we're starting to see advancements in this content, and we need to start thinking about how we're going to double check that content, which always goes into our efforts to cross-verify content. Here's another question for you. Has anyone been to Seoul in South Korea? Hey, we've got some people. Does anyone recognize this image? This is actually in the center of Seoul. Has anyone gone walking through parks in Seoul at all? Or no, I think we've got some shy people here. So this is a park in the center of Seoul, or what looks to be a park. If I was to go for a run in that, I think I'd be running into a few trees, and you can see the road on the right there. So this is Nava Maps. Hopefully it's not recorded, otherwise that's a lawsuit. But this is Nava Maps, which is a South Korean mapping system. And if you see that little road on there, it's very unfortunate if you're driving, because you're basically driving into trees, right? Same as on the left, if you're driving down that road, oops, you suddenly drive into trees. We go on the next slide. We can actually see what that looks like on Google Maps. Those two images are the same location, one on the left, one on the right. It's actually a government facility in the middle of Seoul. So the next time you go to Seoul and you want to run in a park, don't use Nava Maps, which is the local mapping system. You might accidentally run into that. What that is manipulated satellite imagery, right? It's a way to add trees to make it look authentic, but to actually hide what's underneath it, which is a really interesting aspect if we think about truancy of satellite imagery and reliance upon satellite imagery as well, is that it can be put out by certain organisations to obscure facts and obscure truths. And us as journalists, we don't want that happening, do we? We want to know what's underneath this stuff. So next time you see a satellite image popped out, for example, if you're working on Israel and you're using Google Maps, which is blurred, and you use the local state-provided maps, which is absolutely high-res and up-to-date, you might want to think about what's obscured or what's blurred there.
We want to approach satellite imagery like we would with other sources as traditional journalists, and this is one example where you want to think about where did this come from, what might that government or group have to hide. So here's another example. Some of you may have seen this same slide earlier today from our colleagues on the New York Times visual investigation team. So in February and March, during the Russian occupation of Bucha, there were photos and videos online of bodies in the street, on Yablonska Street, and immediately the Russian disinformation machine kicked in. They said, you know, those bodies appeared after Russians left the town. The New York Times visual investigation team was able to go to Maxar Technologies, a commercial satellite imagery provider, and prove that actually those bodies had been on the street while the Russians were still occupying the town. Nevertheless, despite this satellite imagery and clear evidence for a lot of us, the Russian disinformation machine is strong and doesn't give up. They questioned this satellite image. There was a lot of disinformation about it couldn't have been taken on that date. They misused the Maxar website. Ben's group at the Center for Information Resilience, they referenced another satellite imagery provider, Planet, which had the same street in the same time period and also showed the bodies on the ground. With the growth of satellite imagery comes the growth in disinformation, but also there are more and more providers. Every week, I feel like I'm hearing about a new satellite imagery provider. It allows you to cross-verify in a case like this from reputable sources.
Great. So I'll grab that one off you. We're going to go into some case studies now. We all like to talk about some of the cases we've worked on, but specifically the tools that we've used and how we've worked on them. This is a kind of methodology that we've, Reed and I have agreed upon, and we use this in our own practices with our own groups. But it's the kind of 6 questions that we ask ourselves when we look at a satellite image. I think many of you are aware of these kinds of 6 things. It's, very journalistic principles, right? Where, when, what, who, why is this important? But when we think about satellite imagery, we also try to analyze it with these questions in our mind so that also we don't get overwhelmed with the amount of information we're trying to digest as well. So we think to ourselves, okay, where did it happen? So where was this satellite image? Where is the thing in this satellite image happening? Maybe where is the convoy driving that we see in this satellite image? Where is the rocket firing towards that we see in this satellite image? And questions like this, right? When did the change or event happen? When did the fire happen? When was that window of time? Things like that. What was seen in the image? What actually happened? What occurred over this window of time? Perhaps if we have 3 images over a couple of weeks, what happened? Did that village burn down? Was there something after it? And also who might have been affected or who caused it as well. So for example, one of the cases we're working on at the moment for Sudan, we're having a look at ethnic tribes, right? Who is in that village that's being targeted, or those villages that's being targeted, and then who caused the event? And that goes towards those last 2 questions, right, which we always like to think about. How does this fit into the bigger picture? What's that situational awareness around the event that we're seeing? How does this fit into that jigsaw puzzle? And why is this important in that context? And that's where investigative journalism is so core here when looking at this kind of content, is fusing that imagery with, for example, videos or photos from the ground, witness testimonies that you'll see from Nigeria with the mass graves that Reid will talk about, and things like that. Before we go into any human rights abuse content, I wanted to start off with something a little bit more lighthearted. We've all been trapped in this conference hall quite a fair bit today, so I thought everyone would love to see a lovely, warm pool. Does anyone know where this might actually be located? Hey, have you guys been there? How did you do that? Okay, right. Well, we know where he's staying. Party at your place. Cool. So how do you guys know it? How do you recognise this?
Well, it's at the Courtyard Towers Hotel on the second tower, number 2, 20th floor.
And what in the photo did you sort of see that made you instantly think about that? Okay, yeah. Did anyone spot like the things in that? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right. So we've got the Ferris wheel, we've got that kind of tower in the theme park there, the thing with the needle that drops up and down with lots of people screaming on it, and those sorts of things. And obviously these guys with the lovely pool that I think they'll be chilling in tonight, so party at their place. Cool. So yeah, like, you know, these objects that immediately some people recognise as, hey, I know where that is. Great. So a cool thing that we always use and we love to use, and Reid and I use it a lot, and I think a lot of colleagues use it, is Google Earth Pro. It's an awesome application. It's freely available. Just because it has Pro at the end doesn't mean you have to buy it or pay for it. But you can download it, and it's one of the best easy-to-use mapping platforms. Okay, it's made by Google, so you know you can take from that what you want. But it's an awesome product that provides free satellite imagery and also historical satellite imagery. It allows you to tilt, pan the map, and also add pins. You'll notice a lot of cool documentaries and things like that also use Google Earth when they fly around. A cool thing for Google Earth, and for those of you that have been busy, stuck in this conference hall, if you want to see Gothenburg in your spare time but you can't walk at all, you can have a look on Google Earth in 3D and fly around Gothenburg and see all the beautiful areas, right? And so this is a thing that we call geolocation. For example, we can have a look on Gothenburg at the Ferris wheel, and that's that needle that we saw. Unfortunately, the Ferris wheel has a chunk out of it, so maybe Godzilla walked through or something like that. But it allows us to geolocate, right, and to cross-reference this image with what we see on satellite imagery or a mapping platform. And that's really useful for us if we think about doing other things like finding out where that pool is, so now we know the location of our friend's apartment, seeing that exact pool, but also other things. For example, this is a free application called Sentinel Hub, which uses NASA imagery, so the kind of imagery that only nerdy scientists can access. It brings it to the masses. It democratizes satellite imagery in an easy, clickable way. And Sentinel Hub is really cool because you can actually create time lapses, satellite images over time. So if I took a photo of my face for the past 5 years, you'd see, and for every single day, you'd see I get a little bit older. Same thing, but for the Earth's surface. A selfie every day of the Earth's surface. And this is kind of cool, and you're probably wondering, what the hell is the red thing on the right, that blurry spot? So the red thing is a filter that I've added, and it's kind of like adding an Instagram filter on your selfie to make yourself look better, only we're adding a filter to this satellite image here to show vegetation levels. So for those of you working in deforestation and climate change, you're probably like, aha, this is cool. And so that image is really useful because we're able to detect, for example, when vegetation levels are low and when vegetation levels are high. Points for winning if you guess that maybe it's low in winter and high in summer. So it shines brighter in summer and shines less brighter or less red in winter as well. Really cool, freely available applications that we've got at the power of our fingertips. So now you've seen some fun examples. Reid is going to take us through the same kind of techniques, but on something a little bit more serious.
Thank you. So we're going to apply those same skills to Nigeria, to an investigative project that we have recently published. And the cool thing, I think, about this case study is that it shows that you don't need crazy advanced skills to make use of satellite imagery in your reporting. So just for a little bit of background on this project, so in December last year, we at Reuters published a 4-part major investigation into human rights abuses by the Nigerian army. And as part of that, we had a lot of leads on airstrikes that killed civilians. And we really wanted to write about the Nigerian Air Force, in part because the US provides so much weaponry to the Air Force. And we really quickly honed in on this one airstrike that took place in January 2023 of this year, in part because there was a lot of open source coverage and photos online. So this was an airstrike that killed dozens of herders in Nasarawa State. At this point, it wasn't feasible for us to send someone into Nigeria. It was, for us, dangerous to be reporting there. So this was a time where we could make use of satellite imagery. So we were lucky enough in this case to get a video of the mass grave from a source where supposedly some of the herders who were killed in this strike were buried. So my first step was to go over some of those questions that Ben asked earlier. Where was this taken? When was this taken? And how does it fit into our bigger narrative? So the first step that I did, which I would recommend if you're starting out in geolocation or if you've got a video, is to build a composite image. So I took a bunch of screenshots of this video and I put them together in a free program called Paint. You can use Preview, you can use the photo program of your choice. And the reason I find this helpful is because I think it's really hard when you're looking at a moving video, especially one like that shakes a lot, to translate from that video to something like Google Earth or Sentinel. So I built a composite sketch. And using this composite sketch, I started identifying features that I might be able to see in satellite imagery. So here you can see behind the trees these 3 buildings with blue roofs. I also focused on the trees. They're big trees. There are a lot of them. And in the very back, you can see this distinctive looking roof, which I've blown up for you, which I thought I might be able to see in the satellite imagery. So we actually got a tip-off. The next thing I do, which I would just say, if you're starting out, and I still do this if I'm stuck on a geolocation, is I go from my composite sketch that you have here, and I draw out what I think that might look like in a satellite image. And I find that helpful because, at least for my brain, sometimes it can be difficult to translate this sort of, on-the-ground image to a bird's eye view. So I sketch that out, what I think it's going to look like, and that way when I'm going through satellite imagery, I can try and pattern match what the buildings look like to what I'm looking in the satellite imagery. So we were lucky enough in this case to get a tip-off about where this was. Someone told us that this mass grave was near the Emir's palace in Doma. And Doma, kind of cool, have Google Street View. So this is an example. I dropped into Google Street View. I found this palace that we had been told about. And I zoomed out to look at what might be near this palace we were told the mass grave was. This is the palace. Looking around the palace, which is this bottom left-hand dot, I didn't see anything that looked like it could be the place we were looking for. There wasn't really an area with enough dirt. There wasn't that same collection of buildings. This is a case, unfortunately, in some of your reporting, you get tip-offs that aren't correct, right? So this is a case where the tip-off didn't seem to be correct. So I stepped back, and I went back to my composite image. And I thought, what am I looking for? These buildings, these trees, this roof. So I zoomed back out and I looked all around Doma what could match that, ignoring this palace. And I quickly focused on this spot near the government secondary school in the lower right-hand bit of the map, right? Why? I saw this area of buildings. It looked kind of similar. We have this big dirt area. And actually, we've got this distinctive roof as well. So it seemed pretty good. Unfortunately, this was the most recent satellite image available on open source methods at the time. It was taken in April 2022. The airstrike happened in January of this year. So the mass grave is not going to be in this image. So I approached a commercial satellite provider called Planet, and I asked if they had a higher resolution, more recent image of this area. And they didn't, but they tasked a satellite for us to go take a photo. So this is the image that Planet captured on May 30th of this year. And in that same spot where I had geolocated the video we'd gotten from a source, the ground was disturbed. So if you go back to the other image, you see the same area. You can see pretty clearly it's been dug up and dug up in this time period that we were interested in. So using that, we were able to confirm what we had been told, that there was a mass grave of herders in this area. And this is a quote from one of the people in the story who said that they thought there were going to be an attempt to sweep this under the rug, like unfortunately there has been with a lot of airstrikes by the Nigerian Air Force that have killed civilians. Satellite imagery allowed us to verify this story and publish. So just to summarize, first I built a composite image, then I geolocated using open source imagery, and then I went to a commercial provider to get a higher resolution image and do further analysis.
Great. So we're going to take you away from Nigeria now and into a country that I'm very, very passionate about in Southeast Asia, Myanmar. And for anyone that's been following news from Myanmar over the past 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you'll see that there are a number of undocumented and uninvestigated human rights abuses. In this specific series of cases, I'm going to speak about mapping, documenting, and investigating burned villages within Myanmar. So this is actually emerging from a project that we started up for free. So it's not some fancy thing that starts with a lot of funding. It was actually started up by myself and someone else in this room who led the project, sitting up the back there. And a number of university students, as well as a number of individuals from the country. We did this in our spare time, so when people were out partying on Saturday nights, we were working on this in our laptops, in our pajamas, from our couch. And what we were doing is moving around this free platform that I mentioned to you, Google Earth, and watching for where things were actually occurring, where change was identified. For anyone that knows what happened to the Rohingya people in Rakhine State, there were some horrible allegations of very grim events. There was lack of internet connectivity in the region, lack of access to the region, and serious human rights abuses committed by the military. And when we were scouting around on Saturday nights or weekends looking for these things happening, we were able to witness from our couches events like this, with this village razed and burned to the ground. Many more villages razed and systematically burned. And that white thing that you're seeing, those white patches, are leftover traces of ashes where homes were burnt down. And this is all captured and stored on satellite imagery on Google Earth. So we thought to ourselves, well, these are not the only ones, and while there's a mass amount of reporting out of this, perhaps we can contribute to this environment by looking at this satellite imagery and supporting investigative journalism and doing our own investigations. So as a volunteer group, what we actually started to do is systematically count, hand by hand, every single building that we saw destroyed. So every single white ash deposit, white building, home that was destroyed, and hand count those things. You're probably laughing at us if you learn machine learning, by the way, thinking, what on earth are you doing? This was before a little bit of automation. And so what we started to do was we built a grid over Rakhine State. We separated that grid and we said, Tom, Kaylee, Sally, Ben, you take these grids and we take these grids. And we basically separated them like this, hand counting every single building. And so what we did after that is we thought, okay, well, let's publish this. So it's called Acheli, the acheliproject.org. You can go to the website, and we published every single bit of data. So all those cool spreadsheets that you see, and for those of you that love spreadsheets, I think this one's quite beautiful. But it's actually quite horrible because it's hand-counted buildings that have been burned down, date, window of time, local name. If you think about machine learning and you want a data set, this is all publicly available. So we've made the Google spreadsheets publicly available, the Google Drive with before and afters of that satellite imagery, should it ever be closed down or removed as well. And we started to think about what happened after that. So where those villages were burned down, we noticed military facilities built on top of them, refugee facilities built by the military on top of those homes that they just burnt down. How odd is that? Burn down someone's home and rehouse them on top of them in something that you've built. So we published all of this information, and we also started to do investigations around this. And the result of one of these investigations was an article that we wrote called Burn, Destroy, Erase. And like I showed you the satellite imagery before in those time lapses from Sweden, we used the same technique over certain areas around, say, for example, Mungador in northern Rakhine State. And this is a time lapse that you can see on both of these. And what it shows is, I used the green one. It's a vegetation filter that I applied to that. And what you can see is a burning of the land in 2017, and then the bulldozing of that land in 2018. just to remove any trace of evidence that has since been preserved only by satellite imagery and witness statements. This is really important if you think about capturing that. Now, these are events that happened between 2017 and 2019, but I think many of you that know anything about Myanmar or international news know that there was a coup that happened in 2021 as well. And that's been the forefront of a lot of our minds. Ongoing, there has been more and more villages being burned down up until this week, or at least this month. And for something that we wanted to look at, we wanted to think, okay, how do we monitor this as it happens, rather than looking back on these events? How do we capture this in more real time? So if you're a little bit nerdy and you like to watch wildfires and do remote sensing science and kind of those NASA nerdy people, you might know about this website. It's called FIRMS. It's from NASA, it's publicly available, and it takes heat signatures every single day, everywhere in the world. And it updates these heat signatures on this map. So you can have a look at heat signatures, for example, fires that might have happened today, yesterday, last week, 3 years ago, whenever you like. If I show you Myanmar for 1 month, this is what it looks like. Pretty insane, and that's something we can't manually hand count on a Saturday night. So we started to work around levels of automation and levels of ways to actually think about this. And we started to actually take village circles and pick up the heat signatures that only happen within those. So we knew that this fire was happening in a village rather than a wildfire in a forest somewhere. And we started to identify case studies, for example, and thinking about that journalistic scope of zooming out and then zooming in. I'm going to take you into this case study of Thant Lang, which happened in the mountains of northern Myanmar, a city or a lovely town that was burnt down 20 times. That's what it looked like on NASA FIRMS. This is what it looks like on Google Earth. Very lovely here, but absolutely decimated in 2023 after those repeat attacks by the Myanmar military. So what we've been able to do is to create public mapping, which is one of our kind of products. We sometimes create products that help people like NGOs, CSOs, advocacy and activists, as well as news reports. And this is a publicly available fire map by our project, Myanmar Witness, which is available to peruse. And you can see, for example, all the dates that we've captured there. And that's how we've been able to document that many villages. Zooming in on Thant Lang, you can see how many of those have been hit. By collecting that data over time, we've been able to create products like this. So this is a video documenting those things, those events in Thant Lang, and taking footage that we've identified on Facebook, layering that on 3D maps that we've made of the town, because Google isn't going to make beautiful 3D maps of Thant Lang, sadly, and actually showing visually, by using that satellite imagery of documenting those burned villages, just how many of those buildings have been destroyed. That's the kind of products that we've been able to make thanks to the advent of satellite imagery. But further than that, we were also able to gain statistics and have a think about, okay, is this the direction that the military is trying to take in this place? So say, for example, we noticed a military operation happening in Sagaing, 290 villages were burned down in that region between that window of time. We've collaborated with a number of news outlets, so I think in one of the sessions before you would have seen Washington Post talk about the collaboration that we did with them, and also our colleagues who might be in the room here from Sky News as well. And that's really helpful because we're able to take this data and this kind of robotic, nerdy satellite imagery stuff and give it the human story and the human impact, right? And give it that kind of probative value to show why it's important. So just to kind of wrap up on that case, what we did was we showed the wider scale of firms by using that zoomed out view of how much how many fires or heat signatures there were in Myanmar. And then we zoomed in on specific case studies and verified those with satellite imagery, and then verified that human story and that specific case in that window of time using footage from the ground. I'm going to pass to Reed.
Okay, a completely different example. So probably a lot of people in the room followed reports of stolen grain after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We also at Reuters were following this, and we wanted to report on it. So my first step was to reach out to Yorick Isaac, who, if you don't know him, He is a ship spotter, also known as the Bosphorus Observer in Istanbul. And we were following, in particular, one of these ships called the SV Nikolai, which we suspected was maybe taking Ukrainian grain, passing it off as Russian, and selling it to Turkey and Syria. So Yorick, for us, traveled from Istanbul to Izmir to film this ship arriving. And offloading, you can see here, corn from the ship into trucks in Turkey. So one of my colleagues on the Russia desk got a hold of the owner of SV Nikolai and said, where does this grain come from? And he goes, oh, we picked it up in Port Kavkaz in Russia. And he gave us documents that were stamped Port Kavkaz. We suspected that that wasn't true, but how did we prove it? So what I did first is I went to ship tracking data. I don't know how many people in this room have used ship tracking data before. Awesome. So it can be great, but in this case, unfortunately, it can also be not so great. So if you look here in the time period in question in June 2022, there's 10 days of gap from the ship tracking data. So the ship was in Samsung, then it vanishes. 10 days later, it's in Istanbul. Where was the ship? Ship owner says it was in Kafkaz, but we think that's not true. If you look at a map, this is what that data looks like. The ship leaves Samsung, it's supposed to be in Kafkaz across the Black Sea, there's nothing. And all of a sudden, it's back in Istanbul. So I thought we could look at satellite imagery. So my first step was to go to open source imagery. We suspected, given reports at the time, that ships picking up stolen grain were going to Sevastopol, to the grain terminal there, but we weren't sure. So I wanted to see, was this ship in Sevastopol during this time? So I went to open source imagery. This is Sentinel. Unfortunately, while Sentinel is great for some things, it's not very high resolution. So Sentinel had an image in the time frame, but as you can see here, there's a ship at this terminal, the Aval or Avlida grain terminal, but I have no idea what this ship is. It's way too blurry to do anything with. So I went to Planet and I asked, do you have any imagery of this port in the time period in question? And actually, Planet had taken a high resolution image of this port almost every single day since the start of the full-scale invasion, and they gave us all of those images. So I was able to go to this time period where there was the gap in the shipping data and find our ship at the terminal where it said it wasn't. And how did I know this was our ship? So my first step was to look at open source photos of the ship in question, SV Nikolai. So I looked at the satellite image. I saw we had a ship here with a flat stern and a pointed bow, and we have 3 grain sections on this ship, right? Lo and behold, SV Nikolai in photos has similar markings. I was working off of a database that I had built of ships that were in the Black Sea in this area that had gone offline, so I had a limited number of ships to look at. But this isn't perfect. There were a couple other ships on that list that had similar characteristics, so I wanted to be a bit more exact. So the cool thing about satellite imagery is that if you get a raw image as a TIFF, you can import it into a mapping program, for example, Google Earth Pro, the free program we've gone on about a bit in this presentation. So I took that image and I imported it into Google Earth Pro. And you can use this tool on the upper left, which is the measurement tool, and to measure whatever you're interested in. In this case, I wanted to know how long is this ship and how wide is this ship. So here we go. I measured this ship, and it matched exactly to the SV Nikolai and the characteristics we had. So we were able to publish a story that placed this ship in Crimea when the ship owner had said actually it was in Port Kavkaz. So to summarize, I verified with tracking data with open source imagery. I went to high resolution imagery to have a greater ship ID, and then we did a more detailed analysis using mapping software.
So that's a fascinating case, the other one, yeah. Looking at tracking of shipments and verification of that. I'm going to take you into something a little bit more grim now, and this is a project we've been working on obviously prior to full-scale invasion. And it really stems from our monitoring of what's been happening in Ukraine. So this is a map that we've made. It's publicly available. Some of you, our colleagues in this room, may have used this before. It's eyesonrussia.org. It's a collaboration, so it's basically the strength of crowdsource in one image right there. It's a collaboration between us, Bellingcat, GeoConfirmed, and many smaller groups, including many in Ukraine as well, to mass verify every single photo and video uploaded to social media. So at the moment, what you see is 20,000 dots on that screen. And those are 20,000 videos and photos since the full-scale invasion. That kind of shows that in a timeline. So what we've been mapping and categorizing is, for example, attacks on civilians, destruction of infrastructure damage, Russian military movements, and the subsequent war on Ukraine. And I'm zooming into a case study because it's quite interesting, one of the impacts we saw of that. That map alone has been viewed more than 6 million times since we created it, and relied upon daily by many individuals, including those in Ukraine. And it's really interesting to think about. So we were heavily documenting what was happening and verifying what was happening in Mariupol, especially during the siege in the beginning and then the subsequent occupation of that region. When the occupation occurred, it was quite interesting to see the drop-off of content being uploaded as that kind of happened, and we noticed that significantly. On that map, we've been uploading, for example, every single dot you can see refers to tweets or Telegram posts or VK posts or Facebook posts. For example, there's a colleague of ours, Christian, from New York Times, who also works with us on this map to basically verify that content. And here he's posting about a burial site east of Mariupol. And we noticed that that kind of drop in social media information or uploads to social media during that occupation. And a lot of people were asking us, hey, I've fled Mariupol, but I don't know what's happening. Journalists were asking us for information. We had colleagues being asked, what's going on. And there was a real lack of kind of activity coming out of that. Sometimes we get lucky and we get to understand what's happening. And one of the questions that was posed to us a lot is around allegations of bodies being moved out of Mariupol. Where are they going? How many are they? And what's happening here? And we wanted to try and verify these claims, or at least give an estimate and provide visuals to that so that there could be some strong reporting on it. And one of the videos that we're able to identify in a Telegram channel was this one. And it's quite interesting because we rarely see things like this. It's a cemetery northwest of Mariupol, where we can see lines of graves being dug and new plots of graves. This was helpful for us. It was horrible to look at, and especially for our Ukrainian colleagues on our team. But it was horrible to look at, but it was also helpful at the same time, because we were able to count in those squares how many graves were being dug in each square. And it gave us a metric or an indicator, so that then we could go to satellite imagery and use the same sorts of things that we've been talking about to count in weekly satellite images how many new graves were popping up in this with that same metric that we're able to see, and really keep a count of that as to how many grave lines and how many full graves. What we're able to work on is a specific metric that we're able to share with newsrooms. So our colleagues at BBC were able to use this graphic and report on this, where we're able to use satellite imagery to calculate change. So for example, in May 12, we noticed 1,700 new graves. In between May 12 and June, 1,400. October, 1,500 new graves. And that was really helpful to get a kind of estimation of those numbers, or at least those numbers, but also visuals to add to that impact. And this was one of the stories that we worked on with the BBC, and one of the quotes that hit me the most, and one that was quite sort of why we do this work and why we're so proud to do this work, is that someone who had fled Mariupol basically said people should know the truth about these horrors, right? And so that it will never happen again. And I think that's really important for us when we think about staring at satellite images and staring at data and things like that, is the human story behind it and the probative value that it has to give to those allegations and claims and things like that. So by looking at that case study that I just showed you, what I basically took you through was the scale of impact of something through understanding that through the lens of phones filming what's happening on the ground, and zooming into one of those case studies to show the footage of what that actually looks like, and then identifying from that single day of footage how that looks like over time through different satellite images, like that selfie of the Earth taken every day and how that change occurs.
Okay, so we've touched on some applications of satellite imagery, but as the field grows, more and more things are possible. So we're just going to give a nod to some other techniques and some other projects, but obviously, again, this is the tip of the iceberg. So I wanted to show you these 4 maps, which involve more intensive data analysis. At the end of the day, a satellite image is really just pretty awesome Earth data. And oftentimes when we look at it, and through a lot of this presentation, we've been looking at it as a photo, but you can also analyze it as raw data. So on the upper left, you have a map of malaria risk zones. That's done on Google Earth Engine, which is a free coding tool that uses open source satellite imagery to do earth science analysis. On the upper right, you have Global Forest Watch. They're a group that uses satellite imagery to do analysis of forest cover, gain, and loss. That's great if you're reporting on environmental issues, the destruction of the Amazon, that kind of thing. Bottom left, you have flooding in Mozambique. So I showed you at the very beginning some examples of satellite imagery in Derna. Well, the cool thing with satellite imagery is you can actually calculate how much of the land has gone underwater. So this is an example of that being done. And on the lower right, you have a group called Global Fishing Watch. So Global Fishing Watch has a very cool map. They've recently integrated satellite imagery, as we know from ship tracking. Not all ships are broadcasting their location, so they have integrated some satellite imagery, so they're able to show that there's a ship in that area that might not be broadcasting its location that is fishing. This is called Global Fishing Effort Map.
Great. So I think it's been Christmas for a lot of people who are interested in satellite imagery recently. The US government, and specifically the US military, a month ago decided to unleash clear synthetic aperture radar imagery, which you've seen probably being blasted around on Twitter. It's called SAR imagery. We think that that's probably going to be next year's hot thing for satellite imagery. It essentially, where you would see a normal satellite image like what we've been showing you, so optical imagery that has colors, it has cool things, this takes an image with radar by picking up that radar. So for example, one of the satellite images that was originally posted by Radio Free Europe, specifically the Schema group, schemes, you can see that one on there. That's actually a satellite image, so the one that's flashing, that's a satellite image of an airbase within Russia that was reportedly bombed by Ukraine. And it was a very cloudy day to try and assess the damage scale and the aftermath of that. However, that cloud that you can see there, synthetic aperture, so SAR imagery, goes through clouds. So the image below it is a radar image, a SAR image, that's able to pierce that cloud cover and actually show the rest of that image. And we're able to see those destroyed planes behind that cover. A little bit hard to read sometimes, but when it gets a little bit clearer and the magic that can be done with it is quite interesting. So the image on the right is Burning Man Festival. We've seen a lot of news about how horrible it was with all the mud. Don't sue me, Burning Man. But what we can see in that image is quite interesting. So that's an image that was actually fusing 5 or 6 images together of a 4-day window of time. And in the red or orange, which not really too clear up there, but you can see there's a red or orange that detects vehicles that have left, and the blue or green detects new vehicles that have arrived. And that's an image that's been taken over that time to do change detection via radar imagery. So if you think about the applications of that for deforestation, if you think about the applications of that for movement or infrastructure damage, it's quite incredible, and I think we'll start seeing a lot more of those products coming out. So we've shown you a lot of ultra-modern techniques and a lot of interesting ways to do things that definitely was not there for Marie Colvin to use as she was perched upon that mountaintop or as she was doing a lot of her impactful reporting. But things that are available to people like Dasha at the fingertips of her phone, right? Why we've shown you this is because we believe that this is important to use, it's important to know how to use, but we encourage you to get more into it, like what we've been able to do with our investigations. Specifically for people like Reed and I, and for me especially, I really get motivated by this sort of content because it helps bring a level of accountability for what's happening for people like Dasha who are fighting for their country, or for people like what's been happening in Nigeria or Myanmar, where we can't access those areas, but we're still able to do thorough investigations and document what's happening. I'm Ben Strick, this was Reed. It's been an absolute honour to be with you and an honor to share all of these techniques with you guys. This is a QR code. It links to a sheet with all of the resources. I also run a YouTube channel which has a few million views that teaches you how to use this kind of content and how to go through this content. And you can always reach out to Reid and myself if you want to hit us up for that content. Please scan the QR code. It's a document with all the links and tools and guides, and also hat tip some of our colleagues as well. Thank you so very much for your patience and attendance today.